this. There we go. All right, thank you guys all for coming. I hope you all had an awesome spring break. I know we did in Texas. We're absolutely exhausted, but it was a phenomenal trip. So we're gonna try and get the video made this upcoming weekend and have that posted soon so you guys can see it all. It was awesome. So I hope you guys had a great break too. Other stuff coming up. I know we have a trip this upcoming Sunday going for woodcocks at the Tell. Unfortunately, I might not be able to be there, so Amy's gonna send out the times, transportation, all that stuff. But I have the things in the groovy to like on the message of all that to sign up. So you can check that in there. Other than that, next meeting in a couple weeks, I think we're doing a spring migrant ID workshop. But other than that, that's it announcements wise right now. I think the bonfire store is still open. Yeah, okay. So if you wanted any of the OHIO or the woodcock paints, like shirts or hoodies or anything, that's open. It should be shipping. Do you remember when that's going to ship? Okay.
Okay, so the store closes on March 24th, so in just a few days, and it should arrive by April 13th.
Okay, cool. So just in time for migration and warblers. But yeah, I think that's about it announcement wise. So otherwise, I'll give it over to Tyler. And for those of you who haven't met him, I think most of you have, but he's our former club president. And now he works for Saber Wing Nature Tours as a birding and photography guide. He is phenomenal at presentations. You saw his last name. You'll see I've known him for a little bit, so he's okay, I guess.
I was gonna give the disclaimer before I make any sort of sly comment at you. I'm her brother.
Yeah. But no, he's awesome. I know this is gonna be a great presentation. I could talk about photography, but I know his will be 1,000 times better. So give it over to you.
Are you gonna leave the lights on?
How do you want it?
I usually see it now.
Yeah, I usually do. Yeah, I'll do them all off since it's photography.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, so that's all I
Like
need
that?
to see.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, I'm very excited to be here again. It's been 2 years since I've been up in front of a ornithology club meeting. It's good to be back. Yeah, like Cassie mentioned, we're gonna talk about bird photography. It's something that I've been doing for a long time, and I'm very excited to be able to do as a career now. And so we'll just go over kind of the basics of a lot of the terminology you might hear, how to get into bird photography, how to best go about doing bird photography, and how to improve your bird photography if you're currently doing so in the field. So starting off is why do we even do this? Like, why am I here? Why do we take pictures of birds? And so there's three kind of major reasons why people would photograph birds. First is for documenting rarities. This is by no means a great photo. Some of you might not even be able to tell what that is until I tell you it's a thick-billed mirror. But now that you know it, you might be able to tell that that's what it is. It's taken roughly a half a mile away off the coast of New Hampshire back my freshman year at Ohio State. And this photo does nothing other than tell you that I saw this bird, and barely at that. But it is a reason why people like to carry a camera while they're bird watching. You can always document that type of stuff. Another reason people can photograph birds and what you can learn from it is studying the plumage of birds. This particular individual, many of you may recognize, is the great black hawk that showed up in Maine back in 2018. And so the image on the left was taken back in August, right when the bird was, shortly after the bird was initially discovered. And the image on the right was taken by actually a former club member in December that following winter. And you can see the difference in that bird's plumage. You can see the bird has started to molt towards its adult plumage, and a lot more of those black feathers are coming in the back and in the wings. And so we were actually able to watch one individual bird molt in all these photos over the course of this 4 or 5 months that the bird stuck around. We were able to see exactly how this hawk is molting, and we knew with absolute certainty that it was the same individual bird because it was the only great black hawk in the United States at the time. And so having that many people coming from all over the country to photograph this one bird, we know that pretty much every day from the day the bird showed up to the day that the bird unfortunately passed away, we have photos of this individual and can go back and track exactly how the bird molted. And then the third way we talk about is just as a personal enjoyment and art form. And that's going to be what we highlight today here. We're just going to be talking about carrying a camera because you want to take good pictures of birds for your own enjoyment, or you're going to share them with people, hoping that they're enjoying the birds that you're out in the field seeing. So that's our focus here today. And so just to go over like a brief, how do we photograph birds? Birds are often moving very quickly. They're really skittish. How do we go about photographing them? How do you how do you better prepare yourself for this? So if we have these like erratic behaviors of birds, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason for what they're doing, how do we best capture them? And so if you watch your subject for a while, you're going to start noticing patterns on where is the bird continuing to come back to perch, where is the bird feeding, what's it doing, how's it interacting with other birds. And as you pick up on that sort of behavior, you'll be able to better predict exactly what's going on, where you need to be, what sort of behavior you're hoping to capture. As well as it's really important to know the environmental conditions around you, because that is just as important. If you know the environment around you, then you're gonna have a much better idea of what the bird's going to do. If you have a duck on the water and you know you're trying for a duck flight shot, and you're not paying attention to where the wind direction is coming from, chances are you're gonna miss the shot because ducks are gonna take off into the wind to get the lift they need. So if you position yourself in a way that the wind is right at the bird, this ringneck duck in the lower right, the wind was at my back going towards the bird, and I knew that the birds were going to take off and land into the wind. So having the light at my back and the wind at my back, I was able to pick specifically where in the marsh I wanted to land, or where I wanted to sit, so that these ducks would be landing right at me. And so I had these ringneck ducks come and land right at my feet there. Also, the surf bird up in the top right, watching shorebirds preen and bathe. Oftentimes, once shorebirds go down, find a little puddle, they'll kind of flick their wings around a little bit, cover themselves in water. Then they're going to shake a little bit, walk up to the highest rock that they can find nearby, and then they're going to stretch their wings out. And so keeping an eye on a bird that was down in the puddle doing that, finding where I thought the bird was actually going to head up and do a little stretch and everything, was able to predict exactly where that surf bird was going to go. And these are things that you just, as you watch the bird more and more, the more time you spend with it, you're going to pick up on these behavioral things. And not only is it going to help you with the individual that's sitting right in front of you, but then you're going to be able to use that time and time again as you encounter similar species or even the same species in many different occasions. So here's another example of that, watching this, the closer of the two least terns sitting on a beach, and this other individual kept flying around grabbing fish and bringing it right back to the bird. But every time that it would come in, it would land and it would throw both of its wings up in the air like that. So Cassidy and I spent maybe a half an hour trying to slowly get close enough and get exactly where we were. I think we were both like hip deep in water to get the angle that we wanted to try to catch this bird right as it came in, bringing a fish for the other one. I think this particular instance, though, he happened to drop the fish, but still came in and did the same thing. So that's why he doesn't have one in this photo. So just a couple of tips when we're applying to birds. So just know the right equipment for you, whether it's what kind of strap you want for your camera, if you like using the basic strap that goes around your neck, if you like using a sling that's going to attach to your lens to kind of redistribute the weight a little bit. If you need to have a tripod with you, I think I talked a little bit about why tripods are important and everything. Know what lenses that you want to use, etc. Just make sure you know what gear so that you're prepared on your end for whatever you encounter in the field. And you need to know your limits and not push it. So the three things with that is respect the birds. This is absolutely the most important. If the bird seems stressed by what you're doing, it's not worth it. Don't push it. We don't want to like be bad to the birds. We don't want to stress them out. We don't want to keep them from doing whatever they're doing. And we want to respect other people. If your photography is compromising the experience of other people, if someone is not going to see a bird because of what you're doing and you flush the bird because of your photography and they're going to miss it, is it really worth it? Are you really going to feel good about the photos that you get at the end of the day? And respect the environment. If you're damaging your surroundings, don't push it either. It's not worth destroying experiences, destroying the environment, or destroying the behavior of this bird just for the sake of a photo. And so approaching birds can be a lot easier than you think in a way that is safe for them, in a way it's calm for them, as long as you're just understanding the behavior of the species you're working with. This is really difficult to explain without being out in the field, and so this is why we're going to be talking about this. We're doing an in-person part paired with this that I'll be doing later on in April. And so it's important to set yourself up in the right position so that the birds come to you instead of you always having to work to get right at the bird. So a couple of examples of that are just things like finding areas where you know birds are regularly coming. So this was out in Oregon. We had a little water drip feature. It was incredibly dry, so we knew that these birds were coming to this watering site. So we got out there before the sunrise, took some lawn chairs, set set up our cameras on tripods, put some cam over us, and we just sat there for 4 or 5 hours. We brought our own logs that we thought looked nice. We set them up around the watering hole so that these birds would have something to land on before they went down to the water. And as a result, we had things like white-headed woodpecker, Clark's nutcracker coming 5 or 6 feet away. As we stayed there long enough, the birds were very comfortable with us being there. We were actually at the point where we were able to talk to each other at just a normal volume right in front of these birds, and they wouldn't even bat an eye towards us. And so this was because we knew where they'd be coming, and we set ourselves up in an area where we wouldn't be in their way, but we could still capture the behavior and the species that we were hoping to. Being able to adapt and find yourself in the right position. So just setting yourself up. We were driving down a road in Minnesota, came around the corner, and this ruffed grouse was out on the road. And so obviously we were going to have to continue to drive down the road anyway. But as we drove closer, we realized this grouse was not leaving the road. So we backed the car up to a safe distance. I think the phone is very deceiving about how close this actually was. So we backed the car below it, got out of the car, using the car as a blind to not like give our shape away. And the bird, we started on, this is Cassidy and Kevin, just laid down in the road and just waited until the bird decided to eventually cross the road. We found out there was another grouse just off the road that it was displaying for, so it was much more focused on this female that was nearby than it was us. So just hiding behind the car and eventually being able to move in front of the car, waiting for this grouse to come out and do exactly what we were hoping it would, and just sit there, show off for us a little bit. So keeping that in mind, rather than when a random opportunity presents itself, rather than just running right at it, hoping to get some photos, just putting yourself in a position and waiting for what you're hoping to come to you, which doesn't always happen, but when it does, it works out better for you and for the birds. Another one is just knowing the easiest way to go about photographing certain species. So when you're doing pelagic trips, just making sure that you're considering where the wind and the light are coming from, the easiest places to photograph from without shake on the boat, putting yourself in those positions with very quick, fast focusing lenses. Zoom lenses are going to have a little bit more difficult time catching a moving bird from a moving boat. So if you have the opportunity to use things like a prime lens, or some of the mirrorless lenses are extremely fast focusing, putting yourself in position for that is going to allow you to photograph things like seabirds at very, very close distances, because the birds are already coming in to check out what you're doing, and you can figure out with the way the wind is coming, which direction these birds are going to come in from, and depending on how intense the wind is, they'll be coming pretty close, shearing by the boat. So just picking up on that type of stuff and situating yourself on the right position on the boat to be able to catch this. We had a point where they were throwing chum out in the back of the boat trying to draw some of these birds in, and it just happened to be that the boat was facing the right direction for the wind, and so we had albatross coming landing right at the back of the boat, but we were able to catch them with like the wing out as they were coming in, running along the water trying to catch some of these handouts that the captains were throwing. And then sometimes getting yourself in the right position might be putting yourself in some weird positions. I'm standing about this deep, so you see how tall I am, that I'm standing about this deep in water because this Pacific loon was hanging out in this little pond. And so I knew the pond was quite large. And so I knew if I picked a spot far enough away from the loon to get in the water and just sat there long enough, if I sat there just long enough, the bird would eventually realize it was on the other side. It would realize I was there. It would realize I wasn't a threat. And as soon as you go back to seeing any sort of water bird diving, preening, feeding, anything like that, they're not going to do that if there's a predator around. If they feel threatened by anything nearby, they're going to have their heads up and alert the whole time. This particular bird was actually keeping an eye on the female who was under the water at the time. So the pair was completely comfortable with us being there. I think I sat there for about 4 hours before the birds eventually came close enough for that. Rather than just wading right out to them, I just sat on the shore in a pair of chest waders and just waited. And so knowing the wind was slightly blowing at me, as you can see by the water. So I knew as the bird was just calm and doing its thing, eventually the wind was going to kind of drift it right by me. And so the bird eventually came very close to me and the group I was with. And another example of this, and this is kind of a more extreme example, is finding ways of luring certain species towards you that you might not normally do. I mean, a lot of people know bird feeders or like a watering feature, but actually taking taking duck decoys out. For anyone who's familiar, this is Metzger Marsh up in Northwest Ohio. We took some duck decoys out just after hunting season would ended to not put us or the birds at risk. And we went out with duck calls and duck decoys, similar to how duck hunters would, but instead we were set up with our cameras, keeping wind and light in mind. This was right at a time where tens of thousands of ducks were staging in Metzger Marsh in late March. And so putting a couple of decoys to kind of coax these large groups that come into the specific unit that we were in was going to allow for a lot of these super close action shots of some of these birds, whether it's takeoff shots, landing shots, or just getting some nice photos of some of these ducks on the water. So this was, again, another 6 or 7 hour activity that we did, trying to get ourselves in a good position for some of these species. And then sometimes it might be climbing down settings to get yourself at more eye level. So this was a large jetty. We climbed down hoping to get eye level photos of kittiwake and thick-billed mirror. And so all of this is just to say, just to know what species you're trying to photograph and go about assessing the situation of how to best put yourself in the position that you need in order to get the photo that you're wanting, rather than charging right into it and potentially not considering either the bird's well-being or your well-being, and assess the situation so that everything works out the best for everyone involved. Sometimes, and then I added this because sometimes odd situations present themselves, and this brown pelican was enjoying handouts from the local fishermen, and so a 15mm lens was all you needed to get some really close-up photos of it. So I saw this bird the first day we were down there, and knew I had to come back another day with the camera. The bird was so tame that people were sitting there petting this pelican, and it would walk right up to people and want its head scratched or something. So we, Cassidy, I just knew we had to take the opportunity for this bird here. So we'll move on, and now we've talked about just like a couple of examples of the main reason for all that was to show you that you kind of need to think creatively sometimes to get yourself into some of these situations. And so that's not the only things to consider, but it also just gives you an idea of like what can go through your mind to help get you into a better position in a way that's not going to stress out the birds or jeopardize the experience of anyone else. So now we're going to talk about just a little bit about like composing the photo. We'll go into after this the technical aspect of bird photography, talking a lot about cameras and stuff like that. But just to talk about composition, since things like light angle and wind angle are going to be a nice follow-up to what we just talked about. So we'll talk about things like light angle, wind angle, framing, the angle of the bird, habitat, etc. in photos. So first of all, is light angle. That's a pretty self-explanatory term. It's literally just the direction that the light's coming from. This photo, you can see all the detail on this catbird here, but you see with that yellow arrow where the light's coming from. This was taken at about noon, and so the light's coming straight down on top of the bird. You get a very harsh lighting. You can see a very harsh, well-defined edge shadow underneath the bird, and the background is kind of a mess with bright hot spots in the highlights and some very dark areas. And it's just not necessarily the most flattering of light angles. And but this happens to be taken at the same time of day, in the same light direction. But in this case, we had a cloud cover overhead. And so because of that cloud cover overhead, you're diffusing the light. So the clouds are going to scatter the light. So rather than get that harsh light angle, you're going to get that scattered, and it's going to give a much softer light. And cloud cover does allow you to photograph later into the day with good quality light than you would on a sunny day. However, the light quality on a sunny day with no clouds is going to be a beautiful light quality if you're out in that first hour or two, and then the last maybe 45 minutes to an hour of the day. So this red knot at Maumee Bay a few years ago, the sun was just setting. I think our shadows were close to 20-25 feet long at this time. The light was right at the horizon and gave a beautiful warm quality. And so keeping in mind where the light angle is, making sure that you have a nice quality of light angle right on the bird is going to be a significant improvement in the photos, as you saw between this and then the catbird a few slides ago. Wind direction. So you see that the wind was coming from the left towards the right in this image, and so larger birds that need a little more help getting going when they're trying to take off, things like waterfowl, raptors, etc., large shorebirds even, are going to take off into the wind because that's going to give them the lift they need to pick up. And so also when they go to land, they're going to put out their wings into the wind, and that's going to create the drag that they need to slow themselves down to land. So keeping in mind where the wind is when you're trying to either do a takeoff shot or a landing shot. It's a little harder to kind of think about this with things like passerines or very quick flying species like grouse that don't need that wind to get going. They've got enough force they can get themselves up in any direction very quickly. But when you're trying to predict the movement of larger birds, keeping in mind where the wind is coming from is really important. And it really helps to have, if you're trying to do photos of something taking off towards you or away from you or landing at you, to have your light and wind coming in the same direction so that the sun is right on your subject as the wind is going right into them as well. And so again, this was that same individual that I knew was taking off. I knew he was going to take off to the left because that's where the wind was coming from. He picked up into the wind, and then he turned, and so then he had the tailwind and came ripping by again. So we were able to predict that, catch him taking off and going in both directions. I think a Jaeger had flown over, and he wasn't too fond of the Jaeger, so he bailed out of there really quickly. And so this is what I was talking about with having a bird taking off or landing right at you, having the light and the wind in the same direction for you. And sometimes head-on angles are not as flattering for some species like this redhead here. Talk about framing real quick. Once you have the photo, keeping in mind in the field how you want the photo to be taken. A photo that you take in the field and landscape and try to force into a portrait image later typically does not look as good as a photo that you intentionally decide in the field that you want to take in portrait mode. That way, when you go into edit, you've left yourself enough room to make sure that you get the composition how you want it. I have an editing talk that covers a lot more of this. So as far as framing goes, when you're actually doing photography, keep in mind what you want the final image to look like. When you're presented with a situation, if you envision what you want this image to look like, when you have it off your computer and you are sharing it on social media or you're printing it to hang, if you know what you want it to look like in the field, that's going to give you a lot better of an idea of what you need to do. So just making sure you leave yourself enough room to crop how you're hoping to is really the main thing. If you have something like the Wilson tour with the sticks coming out of the bottom and the birds facing upward, I like to go portrait there. Or if you have something like the Dunlin who's stretching, it's a very elongated shape when the wings are up like that. That kind of leans itself towards a portrait composition. But something like the snowy plover, sometimes the composition of leaving a small bird in the frame with nothing else to distract you, leaving it on one of those rule of thirds, they call them PowerPoints. And I can talk about that later. I don't have that in this talk. Something like centering the composition on something like this great blue heron that happen to be stretching. It's the only thing that's going to catch your eye in the image. And then talk about composing headshots, similar to that long-billed dowitcher in the bottom right. And so talk about the angle. These next two photos are taken like right at the same spot. It's not the same individual bird, but you'll be able to see they were taken right next to each other, and how big of a difference the angle that you take a photo at helps. Always trying to be at eye level with your subject is going to make a much more personable, much more pleasant photo. I was nice and close to this pectoral sandpiper. I mean, you can see everything you need to see that it's a pectoral sandpiper. The way the light was, the water kind of has a very gray, oily kind of coloration to it. However, the pectoral sandpiper that happened to be just a little bit to my left, once I laid down, to a much different image. Comparing that to this here, they were taken in the same place, same time, but getting down in eye level with your subject totally changes the view that you have, and it's going to create a much more personal connection with your subject, and it gives the bird a whole new personality. Instead of this little shorebird walking around the mud, now you have this striking male pectoral sandpiper who's displaying at the time. So it's a huge difference to be down eye level with your subject, kind of experiencing everything from. You want to capture the photo in a way that people can kind of see things how this bird would see, or how another bird would see this individual. And it makes it a whole different encounter there. So here's a picture of Cassidy doing just that with this white-tailed ptarmigan. And if anyone can't see the bird, it's about right in the center on the right side of the image. So being right down at eye level with this ptarmigan gives you this view, as opposed to trying to find a bird that is notoriously mistaken for rocks and can be very difficult to spot. But when you're right down at eye level with it, then it becomes a whole new thing, and it's actually a very personal encounter with the species. And again, this was being done the same way, and being right down at eye level with this bird actually would have given me a little different setting. So I was down at eye level with the bird, and I was starting to get some grasses behind. I was starting to get some weird coloration of the water that I didn't like. So just raising the camera up maybe 2 feet from eye level with the bird, I was able to get nothing but fall color in the background, in the water with this individual, and it completely changed the look of the whole image. So keeping that in mind, that being down at eye level is ideal, but sometimes you might need to adjust just a little bit to make up for certain things in your background or with your lighting or something like that. And then here's just some examples of what it can look like to intentionally leave the habitat of a bird in the photo, and keeping that in mind as part of the image. So things like leaving the bird smaller in the frame, like the northern wheat ear in the bottom right, but to include every vagrant wheat ear's favorite habitat, which is log piles in someone's yard, or things where species are more specific to a certain plant, leaving that in there, or showing that the habitat of that sapling skull on its breeding grounds, and leaving the bird a little smaller in the frame to be able to capture the fact that this striking pelagic gull just spends its summers laying in the middle of the grass in the middle of the tundra somewhere. And so being able to articulate that, or the camouflage of the great gray owl. So keeping in mind that the habitat of your bird can really be tied into the image and make a much more meaningful image when people see that, oh, this particular bird does depend on said plant or said environment to make for a better image. So here's just a couple more examples of trying to capture some of this behavior. A lot of hummingbirds are specific to certain plants, and so being able to capture something like this green-tailed train bearer on the flower that it likes to feed on gives a lot more meaning to a species or to a photo of the species. And then something like the fulvous vented euphonia, getting to actually photograph them eating from the plant that they tend to eat from in the wild is a lot cooler than just having them sitting on a stick somewhere. It gives a lot more insight as into the bird's like life history and everything. And that's kind of what I like to do, I want to be able to tell the story. I want people who see these images to be able to kind of get an idea of the birds, including habitat or behavioral things like this in that is going to help with that. Just a couple more examples of that here with five-striped sparrow, banana quail, and chestnut-collared longspur. So now we'll go into kind of the more technical side of things and a lot more of the on camera, since we've talked a lot about how to interact with the birds and how to use the birds in their environment to the best of your abilities for photos. Now it's time to talk about the things that we can control. These are the things that no matter what, we have control over our camera, and so here's how to go about doing that the best. So a lot of times your camera is you're going to see the setting style pretty similar to this one. And so you'll have your user settings, a scene setting, auto, and auto with no flash. But then we're going to mainly focus on things like manual, aperture priority, and shutter. And if you are a Nikon user, shutter priority is going to be listed as an S on your camera. And if you're a Canon user, it's going to be TV. If you are using aperture priority on a Nikon, that's going to be A, and it's going to be AV on Canon. So if you're looking at your camera, you're like, I don't see an S. But you have Canon, you're looking for TV, that's going to do the same thing. So we'll talk about those. Manual is going to give you full control of everything. The camera's not going to do anything for you. You're going to set everything that you need to, your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture. You're going to set all that. Camera doesn't get in your way at all. Aperture priority, you're going to set things like your ISO and your aperture. And the camera is going to give you the shutter speed that it sees as fitting based on the setting that the camera is metering. And we'll talk about what all that means here in a minute. Shutter priority, however, is going to allow you to set ISO and shutter speed, and the camera is going to give you the aperture that it thinks is best to meter the setting that it sees fit. And so those are going to be the three manual settings, and those are going to be the three that I recommend, the three that I use, and we'll go about talking about why I think it's important to do those. But first of all, if we're talking about all of this stuff, we need to know what exposure means. So you'll hear people talk about like exposing a photo or something, but what does that actually mean? So exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor. And so we talk about the three settings. You can change your ISO, shutter, and aperture. only shutter and aperture affect the exposure of an image. You'll talk about people saying, oh, my photo's underexposed, I need to increase my ISO. That does not change your exposure in any way, because ISO does not affect how much light hits the sensor of your camera. That's completely different, and that is going to be the sensitivity of your sensor. But aperture and shutter are the only things that actually affect your exposure. And so, again, you see people throw out terms like underexposed, overexposed, and correct exposure. And so we want to talk about what those mean, but they don't really mean anything, because there's no one way to expose an image. There's no right way to expose something. It's all based on what you're trying to do. Correct exposure on an image means that you got the photo exactly how you wanted it to look. Underexposed means that the image is not as bright as you wanted it to be. Overexposed means it's brighter than you wanted it to be. Correct exposure, I mean, this with photography as an art form, you have the vision, you're articulating what it is you're trying to. Correct exposure is what you want it to be. And so it's all up to personal preference. So some of the images here, while it could be the projector, some people may look at some of these images and to them, they might think the image is too dark or too bright. But to me, it was what I was envisioning in the image. And so it's all for interpretation there. So an example of what I would consider to be underexposed would be the snow bunting here. And so you see a lot of detail in the ice that the bird is sitting on. You see a lot of feather detail in the white parts of this bird here. But when we get to the dark areas, like the beak, the eye, the wings, and even in the tail, there's no detail, you just see black. You can tell it's a snow bunting. You can see every field mark you need to know what it is. You can see the habitat that it's sitting on, but it's still, you don't have a whole lot of detail in that dark area. However, here, you can see all the detail in the feathers on the wing and in the feet, in the eye. You don't know what's bird, you don't know what's sky, you don't know what's ice, but you can see the detail in the black, but this is overexposed. So then when you try to find that balance, we're starting to see a little bit of the edging of the feathers in the darker parts of the wing. You lose a little bit of the detail on the ice, but you can still see the general shape of the ice, and we're still getting a lot of that feather detail here. So it's all about finding a balance. Correctly exposing an image is all about finding the balance between the darkest parts of the image, the brightest parts of the image, and then those mid-tone values. And in doing so, you're able to articulate all the detail in the image in a way that people can see everything that they're hoping, or that you're hoping that they get out of the image here. Again, you see there's not still a ton of detail on the feet, but really the feet of a snow bunting, I mean the detail on the foot of a snow bunting is not really the overall goal. Is you can still see the super long spur on the back of the bird, which is arguably the coolest part of the feet of this bird. So we don't really need to see the exact detail on the feet, because you get to see the fact that this bird is sitting on a big chunk of ice. You still see a lot of the detail in the white parts of the bird. So again, I talked about what makes correct exposure, and so it's limiting the accidental clipping. And clipping is when your settings come out and your blacks are so black that there's no detail on them, or your whites are so white that there's no detail on them. And so I have underlined here, it's the accidental clipping, because sometimes you can get yourself into situations where there's no detail in the blacks, but that's kind of what you're going for. There's no detail in the bright parts of the photo. That's what you're going for. But when you do it unintentionally, and you try to recover that later, that's when you're going to start noticing that something didn't quite go right in the field. But when you do it intentionally, and we'll talk about that later, it really can make for some interesting images. And so know your subject. You saw the bird, you know what that bird looks like. And so your goal is to articulate that. So if you're having a difficult time saying, well, what's the correct exposure on a prothonotary warbler? And you go, this image just looks really bright. Well, you were in the field and you saw that prothonotary, it was right in front of you, and that's a very bright bird. And so correct exposure on that might be trying to capture and articulate how bright this prothonotary warbler actually is. Whereas something like a red-winged blackbird, you don't need a super bright image where you can see every single feather detail on the red-winged blackbird, because that's not really how you see them in the field. You don't see every detail on a solid blackbird like that. And so if you happen to not catch all that feather detail, and you brighten the photos so much that suddenly your red-winged blackbird has neon red and bright white on the wings, and there's no detail in the background, well, then that might not be the way to articulate that species. And like I said, just know what you want each photo to look like, and your goal is to make that happen. I want to go photograph this species. I know what this species looks like. I want people to look at my photo and know that is what the species looks like. And so when you have that mindset going in, then you can determine for yourself what is the correct exposure for your image. So I talked about with the camera settings that the camera is going to set certain settings based on the metering of the image. And so what metering is the camera's suggestion for what it deems to be the correct exposure, given the camera's metering mode and given the environmental conditions around you. And so on the left is just a couple of the different metering types that the camera might have: spot metering, partial metering, center weighted metering, and matrix metering. So you see the areas that are highlighted in gray on that, that's when you look through the viewfinder. Those are some of your focus points that the camera may have. On a spot metering, the camera is going to solely give you a prediction of what it thinks your settings should look like based on what is right on that center focus point. That's all it's going to consider. When you do partial metering, it's going to consider a little bit more around your setting. Center weighted metering, the camera is going to consider the background and the environment of the image, but it's still going to be a lot more like that. Partial metering is going to give you a suggestion based on the center of your image. And then like an evaluative or matrix pattern metering is going to be considering the entire setting, and it's a little more like AI focused on the camera, and it's going to give you a smart prediction based on everything. It's going to try to consider what the subject even is. And so that can get to be really good. In general, Nikon's matrix metering is a little smarter than Canon's matrix metering. That's just as far as the technology currently stands on those. And then the image on the right is going to be what it looks like in the viewfinder. When you look in the viewfinder, you're going to see that little -2 to +2 with some increments of third stop increments. That's going to be the camera telling you what it thinks. You point the camera at something, if the camera thinks it's underexposed, it's going to move that little bar to the -1. The camera thinks you're one stop underexposed for what you actually are trying to do. And so we'll talk about how to override your camera, how you're smarter than your camera. You know what you're photographing, and you want to make sure the camera knows what it is you're photographing and how to predict that better. So we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. So shutter speed is the duration that the sensor is open and exposed to the light. So DSLRs have what's called a rolling curtain shutter. I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second. So typically it's going to be listed as anything from usually 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second. And so 1 over something, 1 over a larger number is going to be a faster shutter. It's a smaller fraction of a second that the shutter is open. And so a faster shutter is less time that the shutter is open, which means that less light gets in, which means that less motion blur occurs. That's why faster shutter speeds give you sharper images, because it's less time for the camera to have the sensor opened in a way that it's going to capture any sort of movement going on. And so the default settings for setting this on manual or shutter priority are going to be the back dial on a Nikon camera and are going to be that front dial just behind your shutter release on a Canon camera. And so here's what that rolling curtain looks like. So I'll show you this once. And so what you're seeing here is that everything is moving at the same speed. It's not really feasible to make something that can move 1/8,000th of a second. So what you see is that something like 1/2000th of a second in the bottom left there, and 1/8,000th of a second in the top left are moving at the same speed. However, the 1/2000th opening is 4 times as large, meaning that in the same duration, 4 times as much light is getting in and is going to account for that motion blur. But you see with a little sliver that's open at 1/8,000th of a second, and the time that moves, any given part of your sensor is only exposed for 1/8,000th of a second. And in doing so, the camera is not going to be able to capture as much movement because there's not as much movement happening in any given 1/8,000th of a second increment. And so that's what's going to give you that sharper image. So whenever you hear your camera make that click sound, this is what's happening, as long as you're using a DSLR camera. Mirrorless has a little bit different technology and doesn't necessarily do this the same way. And I'll show you why later. But this is a nice visual of why faster shutter speeds work. And so here shows you what 1/100th of a second looks like. And so the wings on this green hermit, non-existent. The bird hardly even has wings in the image. And so the bird was staying so still on the feeder otherwise that you're actually able to get some detail on the bird itself. And you can see that the hummingbird feeder, which wasn't moving, is still in focus. The water droplets that hadn't fallen yet were still in focus. But there is no detail in the wings or the tail, because hermits like to flick their tails a lot when they're coming into feeders. So between that and the wings, you don't really have much going on. But then with a faster shutter speed, you're able to catch individual water droplets spraying. You're able to catch the moment this Arctic tern hits the water. And that's because the camera has less time at a given moment where motion can actually be even picked up in the image. And so moving at faster shutter speeds are going to help. I believe the general rule of thumb is that you want to catch movement. You want your shutter, you want the number on your shutter to be 4 times what the length of your lens is. So if you're using a 500 millimeter lens, you typically are going to be wanting to use something like 1/2000th of a second. This is the general rule of thumb. However, obviously there are situations where you can get by with a lot less depending on what it is you're photographing. But that's kind of just a nice number to keep in mind. Not bird photography, but just to talk about long exposure and why your camera even has the capability of leaving the shutter open for 30 seconds. When it's pitch black outside and there's no light pollution or anything, your camera can actually stay open long enough that you can pick up stars, you can pick up the shape of the Milky Way. And so something like the image of the tent on the left, we just turned a flashlight on the tent for maybe 5 seconds and then turned it back off of that 15-second exposure so that we could get some light coming in from the tent as well as still capture all that detail in the sky. And so that's just to show you on the far other end of the spectrum why leaving your shutter open so long can create images like this. But it also goes to show that if you have too slow of a shutter speed, if your camera is capable of catching enough detail to show you the Milky Way, then sometimes if you're using way too slow of a shutter speed in the field, you're going to get way too much light, and your image is going to have so much light you're not even going to be able to recover any detail in it. Moving on to aperture. Aperture is the opening of the lens's diaphragm through which light passes. And so the f-stop, you'll see f-stop is typically going to be listed as things like, I believe the lowest that you can go on a typical lens is like 1.4. And then kind of the common stopping point on most lenses is 22. Sometimes you can get lenses that go as low as like f64. And so this image in the bottom right shows you what that looks like. So it's the millimeter measurement of that black diaphragm there. So 2.8 millimeters is going to be much more wide open than something that's 22 millimeters wide. You just get a little opening at the end. And so on Nikon cameras, typically that's going to be the front dial that's just under your shutter to adjust. And on if you're on aperture priority, you're still going to be using that same dial on the back of a Canon as well. And so looking at that, you're going to see that it's going to adjust, or it's going to affect how much depth there is to your image. When you're at a more wide open aperture, you're going to get a lot more shallow depth to the image. But also it's important to consider the distance to your subject when you're keeping this in mind. And I'll show you why here in just a second. First of all, looking at 2 images taken at the same distance apart, I believe these are Cassidy's photos, that you see this. The image of the flower on the left is taken at f2.8 from the same distance as Cassidy took the flowers at f6.3, and you see how many more flowers are visible in that image on the right. We're not changing anything, no distance, no shutter, no difference except for the aperture, and then you see just how much more the image is in focus. However, when you're considering the distance to your subject, both of these images were taken at f6.3. And the image on the left of the cardinal, by the time you get to the feet of the cardinal, they're not even in focus. Something like the Arctic tern on the right, you can still see some definition in the background. You can still see where the background goes from snow to grass to open water back to snow. And that's because I was significantly further away from the Arctic tern. And so that f6.3 the aperture didn't really matter as much when I was further away from the subject as it was when I was right next to it. The cardinal was only a few feet away from me. I think it was barely within minimal focal distance. And so keeping in mind the distance to your subject is going to be big, because if I photograph that cardinal at f22, I might have then still not even had the entire bird in focus. Whereas if I had photographed that Arctic tern at like f1.8, I probably still wouldn't have even gotten the background compressed up. So it all matters. The closer you get to your subject, the more that you're going to need to account for the fact that you might need a slightly deeper depth of field to account for that the size of your subject. Typically with bird photography, you're safe to leave it on the minimal setting. Most common wildlife lenses are going to be a minimum of f5.6 or f6.3. I personally like to recommend that you stay one above your minimum. It's just a little bit sharper. If you have an f5.6 lens, f6.3 is going to be sharper than f5.6 for the most part. For my ISO, we said this is not part of the exposure. It does not affect how much light is reaching the sensor of your camera. The sensitivity of your sensor is amplified when the camera is converting the light to a digital file, and that's what's going to be creating the differences in ISO. So originally, ISO came from the amount of silver nitrate present on the film strip. Silver nitrate was very sensitive to light. So the more you had on your film when you were developing in a dark room, you were able to get a lot more detail or a lot more stuff captured in a darker setting because of that. And so now cameras don't have silver nitrate in them on the sensor. So the sensor is going to be, it's a computer program that's doing that when you click the shutter, your camera is writing a digital file to your SD card. The ISO on your camera is going to be digitally amplifying that sensitivity, and that's what's going to give you your ISO. And so it's going to increase the noise in an image. And so a higher ISO, it's going to give you a brighter image, but it's also going to give you more noise. And so often what you said is you're going to see a button that says ISO. You'll hold that button down, and then you're just going to use your basic dial that you would use to adjust shutter or aperture. And that's going to let you scroll through your ISOs. A lot of cameras even have an auto ISO now, which does have its benefits, but also does have its limitations as well. And so the Pacific Loon image we showed earlier, this was taken at ISO 320. You see in the background that there's not a whole lot of noise going on. Even in that little insert there's still not a whole lot of noise visible. However, the whiskered screech owl in the bottom right with the ISO 5000, you can see in the image alone that there's a lot of noise, and then you can see a lot of noise in that insert. When you're photographing darker subjects or against darker backgrounds, noise is going to be a lot more prevalent. If I had shot that loon on ISO 5000, I probably still wouldn't have even seen that much noise because a brighter setting does not actually pick up that noise near as much. And so here are a couple images of why shooting at high noise is important. Because all these species are found deep in the rainforest, and it is incredibly difficult to photograph in the rainforest just due to how dark it is. But now there's a lot of great software out there that is actually very capable of awesome noise reduction. And so some of them are done based in like your editing software. Photoshop and Lightroom both have really good noise reduction tools. And then they're going to allow you to maintain the sharpness of your subject, but also kind of blend out some of that. But then there are a couple of new AI programs out there that are just unbelievably good. And so are able to preserve all the detail and make your images taken at ISO 10,000, like I believe these images were, and make them look like they were taken ISO 200 or 300. So you get things like wire-tailed mannequin or Orinoco softtail or song wren in no noise settings, which it's really been a game changer. It's really allowing for great photography of certain species without having to lug large lenses or lug flash setups or anything out into the woods. So here's kind of a summary of everything we just talked about, showing you the relation between what aperture, what shutter, and what ISO do. This is a great little reminder. So I'll just let everyone look at this for just a second and see. It'll show you like what it looks like on the camera versus how it affects your image there. So I keep saying the word stop, like using stops as measurements. We're not really going to go over what this chart means, but really the importance is just to know that stops are the unit in which exposure is measured. So it's really important when you're shooting manual to kind of understand the term stops. It gets really messy, but really important when you're talking about like equivalent exposures, and especially when you're working with like off-camera lighting setups, if you're doing portrait photography in like a studio or something, being able to balance all your flashes in such a way that you're getting the exposure you want. What equivalent exposures means is that every increment in your aperture, your ISO, or your shutter is going to be the same amount of light difference as an increment of the other. So an image taken at f6.3 and 1/2000th of a second is going to be the exact same light. It's going to be just as bright of a photo taken at f5.6 and 1/2500th of a second. So for every one increment of one that you adjust, if you adjust another one in the opposite direction, you're going to get that same exposure at different settings. So if you know you like the lighting of an image, you like how it looks, but it's still just blurry enough from motion, just open your aperture up a little wider, increase your shutter just that many increments faster, and it's going to be the same lighting on the image. But a lot of times you'll hear someone talk about like, oh, you're a stop underexposed, you're a stop overexposed, or oh, I would say we'll talk about exposure compensation here, but set your exposure compensation 1.3 stops up. Stops are the measurement that we use for exposure. So exposure compensation is helping you help make your camera metering smarter. So depending on what the setting is, the camera is going to try to balance out what it sees, and the meter is going to tell you one thing, and you're smarter than that. You're going to know that that's not what you want. So we'll go over that here in a second. So how to set it? There's usually a plus or minus button. You hold that plus or minus button, then you adjust your dial, and you'll see it change on your metering. Again, I just want to put a reminder of what the metering looks like, so we can so as we go about talking about this, you see like this is where the camera is getting this information from. This is what the camera is considering when it's giving you your metering. So quick little overview of what it looks like. If you're at a constant aperture and a constant ISO, you're in aperture priority mode and your exposure comp is set at 0. You take an image that looks like this. Cool. You set your exposure compensation to +1. You've just told the camera that the shutter that you gave me for that last image was not what I wanted. I want you to give me a shutter that is 1 stop brighter than what you just gave me. Now you're going to end up with an image like you see on the right. If you set your exposure compensation to -1, then you say, hey, that original image and the shutter that you recommended for that original image, I want it to be 1 stop darker than that. Then you're going to get something like this. And so where this really comes into play is when you're photographing in some more unique settings, if you have a really bright background, like I'm photographing the spectacle light or against ice here, it's a very bright background. The camera is going to see, oh my gosh, that's a lot of white. I need to give him a shutter that is going to expose that image correctly. Well, then it does that, but then all the dark parts of the spectacle light get really dark, because now it's trying to tell me, hey, all this ice is perfectly exposed for you, because that's what most of the image is. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted to capture the detail in the darker parts of this bird. So if the subject's too dark, then I want to raise my exposure compensation. If you give me a shutter of, I don't know, 1/2000, and it's going to give me something way too dark, I might want to raise my exposure compensation to maybe against this setting, maybe +1 1/3, +1 2/3 even. And so in that case, now the camera is going to go, oh shoot, we need to give him a shutter of like 1/1000. So now that's more than doubling the amount of light that's hitting my sensor. And now my whites are going to be a lot brighter than the camera thinks they should be, but it's going to give me the image that I'm actually trying to get here. And so if you're a Canon user, you're typically going to need to use more plus exposure compensation than a Nikon user would. If a Nikon user is deciding that they're going to set their exposure compensation at +1, Canon users might need to go +1 1/3, +1 2/3 even. Their plus compensation is not as sensitive. On the contrary, you would want to lower your exposure compensation if you're photographing a bright bird against a dark setting, like this kittiwake that was flying in some dark fall color. The camera is going to see, oh, I see a lot of dark in the background. I need to brighten this image. Well, then you have a white bird that suddenly you have no detail on because the image is so bright. So you want to turn down your exposure comp. The camera is going to think that, oh, your background is not near as bright as it should be, but your subject is what you're focused on. So as long as your subject is exposed correctly, that's what you're wanting here. And so Nikon has to use more minus compensation than a Canon user would. So this is important for photographing birds against the sky. You have a bird fly up against a very bright white sky. You want to crank your exposure comp up to +2, +2 1/3, just to be able to still get the detail and get the color on your subject, because all of a sudden you have a very bright white background that's taking up most of your image. And the camera's going to really try to expose for that when you're not trying to get it to expose for the sky. You want that bird to be exposed. And so talking about these rules of photography that we've kind of talked about, like this is why you should do this is why you should do this. So why do we have rules? And we have rules in photography so that you can break them, but knowing why to break them. Knowing how to use your camera and what settings to use are going to allow for unlimited opportunities. People are never going to get the same exact image. And so there's a large difference between unintentionally breaking all these rules and intentionally breaking them. And so, for example, if we're out in the field and we're shooting with the light angle is directly on, a very harsh light angle is directly on the bird. It's not diffused, it's not a flattering light, it's a very harsh midday lighting on a bird. And it's not, so if all of these are the rules, if we were to break the rules, we had a harsh light angle on the bird, the sun is not diffused, we are intentionally overexposing our bright areas, we're intentionally underexposing the dark areas. What happens if you break all of those rules all at once? They're not good. You get an image of this red-cockaded woodpecker where you can't really see much of the detail on the bird, it kind of blends into the bark. You get something like the great-tailed grackle that is super bright, so bright white, but the bird's exposed. You can see the detail on the grackle, but you have no idea why the sun is looks like it's up against the sun. It's so bright. And so you see all these things we're talking about. Super dark clipped shadows, super bright highlights. And so this is what happens if you have the camera settings wrong and you're out in the field and it just happens unintentionally. But when you do it intentionally and you know what you're trying to do and you know you're keeping all this in mind, then you end up with something like this. I have the sun on the other side of the subject for me. I'm shooting towards the sun on this image. We talked about wanting to have the sun at our back on the subject. You have the glow around this bird is so bright that there's no detail in it whatsoever. The black behind the eye of the scaspidi is so dark that you can't get any feather detail out of it. And you've got direct light hitting the bird. But when you know all that and you have your settings prepared in such a way that you're trying to capture a backlit subject like this, then breaking all of those rules at once can lead to some very flattering images, because you knew why you're doing everything. You knew this is what happens. If I set my settings like this, I'm going to get way too bright of an image. But if I want it to be way too bright, then I know how to go about balancing that here. And so another example of backlighting. Backlighting with snowfall was able to actually capture all those snowflakes in a way that you can see the weather in the environment. You can see the backlighting coming through all the grasses and the little glow around the bird. Or letting the camera's metering just do its thing and exposing for a bright sky and capturing detail on a sunset and getting nothing but silhouettes on the snowman here. And so we'll end this with kind of choosing the right gear for you if you're looking to get into bird photography. So the most important thing, obviously, is to consider the budget. Obviously, the larger budget you have, the better equipment you can get into, but you can make great images with really any gear you have the option for. And so you got to know what you plan to do. Are you wanting to carry a camera for documenting rarities? Are you wanting to get into photography as an art form? What are you wanting to do just bird photography? Are you wanting something more versatile to be able to do landscape photography, get into doing some people photography? Are you wanting to do mirrorless or DSLR cameras? Are you wanting to get into crop sensor cameras or full frame? Is it really more important to have more megapixels on your sensor? And do you need to go full frame? We'll talk about all this here now. So the differences in cameras, we talk about DSLR and mirrorless are kind of the two most popular ones out there right now. So with a DSLR, you have a mirror inside the camera that is going to reflect light into your viewfinder. So when you look through the viewfinder of a DSLR camera, you are essentially looking down the lens. You're seeing exactly what the lens sees in real time. It's a real view of your subject. And so when you click the button, the first click you hear is a mirror flipping up. And that's why when you take a picture, it goes black for a second. The mirror flips up, so no light's hitting your viewfinder anymore. The light is directly hitting the sensor in the way that you just saw it through the viewfinder. On a mirrorless, the light is just hitting the sensor directly, and your digital viewfinder is connected to your sensor, and you're seeing a preview of what the image is actually going to look like when you click the button. The sensor is taking in all that data live, giving it to the sensor, and so as you adjust your settings, you can see that reflected in the viewfinder as you're looking through it. Some of the pros and cons of them: mirrorless cameras are smaller, they're lighter weight. You get that nice digital preview so you can see what's going on at a given time. It's very easy. There are adapters that allow you to switch between different brand lenses. And so they have these, some of the new ones have these excellent autofocus tracking. They can detect the eye of a bird and they can keep that in focus as the bird's moving around. And it's going to adjust where your focus is to make sure that what it recognizes as an eye stays in focus at all times. And it's a great way to capture moving species. DSLRs are typically bigger, heftier cameras that are a little more durable because there's not as much digital parts in them. They tend to have longer battery lives in them. There's at the time that I made this slide, there was a very well established system of lenses for DSLRs because that's been the standard for so many years now. Mirrorless have really released some just breathtaking quality lenses over the past year or so. So they've really caught up, but there are more options for lenses on a DSLR still at the time. It gives you the option to look down the lens and see things in real time without a digital preview, if that's your preference. And the larger body on a DSLR camera gives you the option for more buttons, so you have more convenient access to a lot of your settings and quick shortcuts than you might have on a mirrorless. But both are going to allow you to make great images, and it comes down to your own preference, what you plan to use it for, and the budget of what you have when you're looking for camera gear. Differences in cameras. The next kind of major talk are crop sensors, full frame, and I'll talk a little bit about micro four thirds in a second too. Crop sensors are a tighter view at the same distance, and they give that extra reach for further subjects. If you're using a 300mm lens on a crop sensor camera, kind of the standard crop factor is 1.5. So really you're looking at the equivalent of a 450mm lens on a crop sensor camera. Compared to if you use that on a full frame, you get the true 300. Full frame is going to be a wider view at the same distance. The larger sensor does allow for significantly more quality. There's a lot more megapixels on a larger sensor. So your file sizes are going to be a lot bigger. It can capture a lot more data. They do handle low light a little bit better, but you do get a much more shallow depth of field. You can see the difference between the D5200 and the D610 in the size of their sensors, how much bigger the full frame is. And then that graphic in the bottom, the orange and white, does show you the size difference in the sensors. So you can imagine if you took a picture of the same thing in the orange as you did the white, but then you stretch the orange out to be the same size as the white, it's going to look bigger. It's going to be closer. And so here's what that looks like. So this image, if I had two people standing next to me and I took the full image you see on a full frame camera with a 500mm lens, person standing next to me took an image with a 500mm lens on a crop camera, and then the person next to me took an image on a micro four thirds camera on the same on a 500mm lens. Here's what all their images would look like. Now imagine all those extrapolated to the same size. You get a lot closer to your subjects on a micro four thirds sensor, which is, I believe, it's the standard for a lot of Olympus and is that what Lumix? Is that your Lumix is a four thirds?
Yeah.
Or at least the one you use, four thirds. Yeah. So Nikon and Canon like to use 1.5 to 1.7 crop factors on their crop sensor cameras, and then all the companies are gonna have full frame options as well. If you can get closer to a subject on a full frame, if I'm standing here photographing a bird at the distance of the wall, and someone is 1.5 times further than me taking a picture, then our images are gonna look the exact same. But now they might have a sensor that's 24 megapixels and I have a 36 or a 45 megapixel even. I might have 20 million more pixels in my image than them. So if I'm closer to the subject on a full frame, I can capture a lot more detail. But it's a lot easier for them to get close to a subject when they're shooting 1.5 to 2 times the effective millimeter length that I am. So again, it comes down to preference. It comes down to what you're wanting to do with it. So for zoom lenses, how much zoom do you need? Knowing bird behavior is going to allow you to approach the birds in a safe way for the subject, causing a less stress. It's going to allow you to not necessarily need to lug around as much gear as needed. And so this can allow you to get by with shorter lenses. My personal preference is having anything in the a minimum of anything in the 400 to 600 millimeter range. It's a great versatile distance. It's going to allow you to shoot very nice full frame or very nice close-up images of birds that are allowing you to get closer, but it's also a good reach if you're trying to shoot something further away. Things using, depending on what lens you're using, adding a teleconverter onto that can give you a nice little 1.4 to 1.7, even 2 times boost if you have a lens that is teleconverter compatible. Kind of my favorite of each is Nikon has a 200 to 500 lens that is excellent for the price range. Canon has a 100 to 400 for their DSLR line. It's great. They have an unbelievable 100 to 500 for their mirrorless lineup. And then Tamron and Sigma have a really nice 100 to 600 millimeter lens as well. So those are kind of my recommendations for each of the different brands there. Talking about bridge cameras is that they have a built-in high zoom in them. You get some really high quality images out of them. You get less quality once you get past their mechanical zoom and you switch into their optical zoom, where similar to your iPhone, it's starting to crop and enlarge the image itself. That's all it's doing, is just cropping your image for you. You're going to notice less light in there because it's actually cropping out a lot of the pixels. They're super light, they're super easy to carry, and they're a great option for the price if you're wanting something. If you're wanting to get some nice images and you're wanting something that's going to be very easy to carry with you just for documenting, this lineup of cameras is really nice. And so with that, if anyone has any questions, there was a lot of information covered, and there's as Kathy knows, I was showing her, I've got versions of this presentation that I've used that are over 2 hours long too, so I've got a lot more stuff I can talk about if anyone has questions. Yeah.
So do you use exposure compensation mostly when you're shooting on like aperture priority or shutter priority, like actually deciding something?
Yeah. So exposure compensation really only does something when you're on aperture and shutter priority, because you're giving the camera the freedom to control one of your settings. So exposure compensation is going to override your metering, which is then going to make the camera have to adjust to compensate for that. If you use exposure compensation on manual, if I'm photograph, I have my camera pointed at the wall and it says that my meter is right on the 0 mark. And so it's saying, hey, the settings that you have, I think are good, but there's nothing I can do about it. You set your metering, you set your exposure count to +1, and then you point it at the same subject, it's going to show you, hey, just so you know, your image is like one stop overexposed, but the camera still can't do anything about it because you still have control. So you can adjust what your camera's metering is reading. I personally don't know of a use for setting custom exposure comp manual, but yeah, using it in shutter and aperture priority is going to give you the best effect, because the camera can do something about it at that point. Yeah.
So like with the Kiskadee photo, right? You had all these like kind of weird lighting
Mhm.
situations and stuff, but you had to like make all those decisions.
Mhm.
The bird was sitting there for like 2 seconds. So if you like kind of set the camera up before the bird lands, like wait for it to do what you want to do, how do you roll that?
So that Kiskadee had just been hunting that little line of mesquite tree. So, and we just spent like a little while walking down the trail towards it. So I knew going in, like, I was going to be able to get close to it. I could see by the way it was behaving, by the way other people were walking right past it, that it was pretty tame. And so I knew going into it, I wanted to set my exposure in a way that like some of those brightest spots would be blown up. I knew that because the dark parts of the bird were facing me, that there was nothing really I could do. There was no light hitting them. So just knowing going in that the bird was going to be approachable, and that I was going to want to maybe if I was on manual, I maybe wanted to drop my shutter a little bit, just to get a little brighter. Knowing that to get any detail on the front of the bird, I was going to have to do a little bit of editing later, lifting my shadows in post-production to catch up with that. But really, similar to the prairie warbler here on the left, the bird had kind of been coming back to a spot where I knew what the lighting was like, and so I was able to predict for that as I was slowly approaching it.
What denoise software do you use?
I personally use Topaz's Denoise AI. It is incredible for the price. What it does, it has 4 or 5 different algorithms that it runs. Depending on it has its standard. It has one that's more sharpen heavy. It'll get rid of some of the noise and it'll sharpen. It's got one that you use if you're shooting like over 8,000 ISO. It recommends you use its low light, and so it's going to handle a lot of the color noise that you get as well. And it's gonna help keep your background smooth and help sharpen up your subject with that. So Topaz is denoise. I believe you get 2 lights. Their standard price, I believe, is $59.99 for 2 licenses of it, which is not terrible if you split the price and the license with a friend like I did. Yeah, and then they run a lot of deals on it too, so you can often find it cheaper than that too. That's definitely my go-to. For very minimal stuff, I'll use Lightroom's masking and sharpness reduction, or sharpness and noise reduction, or Photoshop's as well. But anything heavy duty, I'm gonna run through Topaz. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, how do you typically store your photos? Do you store them like online, or I know my Mac has like 0 space, so I'm always wondering the best way to do that.
So I have a stack of hard drives. So I use Adobe Lightroom as my catalog setup. Adobe Lightroom is designed for raw processing of images, but it's also designed to be a catalog. So I have everything set up like that, and all my images are stored there. I keep of all my favorite images I would show people. I keep on like a website as well, just the JPEG, the export to JPEG version, but I keep all my raw files organized on hard drives. I mean, I've been doing like serious bird photography for years, and I still haven't, because of how much I delete, I still haven't filled up a 2 terabyte hard drive, which is $70-$80 for one that's gonna last forever. It's just USB. And then I have a second one just as a backup. So I store everything on there. I don't keep any images on my computer.
So you don't worry about like the hard drive corrupting or anything?
That's why I keep a backup.
Okay.
I got a backup of one that never leaves my desk. I've never taken it out of my desk. If I go on a trip, actually the way I do it now is I have, like when we were in Texas, I had a hard drive with me. I'd back up to that. Then I go home and I put it onto my main hard drive that I edit with. And then maybe once every couple of months, I back up that whole hard drive to another one. And so that way there's 3 points at which something could go wrong. I still have, like if something went wrong with my good hard drive right now, I might only lose like a month's worth of images. That's how I do it. That's how I store.
Kind of building off what you said with Lightroom though, how you said it was like a catalog. So like you can say like instead of like pulling from my computer, I would be pulling from the hard drive. And then when you unplug your hard drive, it'll say like cannot find this file. And as soon as you plug it back in, it knows to like look for it there. So you don't have to like search for it. It's really well organized and nice.
So it's just as long as you save the pathways.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as the pathway doesn't change at all. And if you do change the pathway, you can go in and relink in it, and it's very smart. It'll figure out like, oh shoot, if that image is here, then that means that this one's here. And changing one pathway and you relinking one image can reconnect on an entire folder of images. So it's really nice. I'll send out a link. I'll give Cassidy a link if she wants to support. I'm about to do a presentation in a month or so for a company that's entirely about using Lightroom as an organization catalog, how to store and back up photos. I can send Cass that, and if you want to like see that information. Yeah.
What's the best way to transfer pictures from, say, like a computer to a phone?
From a computer to a phone,
Like to preserve best
I personally just AirDrop. Because I'm Mac to Mac, so
possible.
AirDrop.
I don't have Mac.
Yeah, so I would say like finding a site or something that you can upload your photos to instead of having to transfer the original file over. I upload like Flickr. If you use your computer and you upload to something like Flickr, or if you create a free SmugMug account or something like that, there are apps on your phone that are gonna allow you to pull up the images at full resolution. People use Google Drive, Google Photos, stuff like that. Any sort of cloud-based thing that you can set up on your computer and upload images to and then access from your phone is gonna be probably the best way.
Do you have an iPhone?
Yeah.
Because what I did, because I used to have a Surface, is I downloaded iCloud Drive on my, or whatever it's called, on my like Surface Microsoft laptop. And you can literally just upload to that and then it like have a shared folder with yourself on your phone. You just download it from, and it's just like instant. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying
It's like through the Files app on your phone, you can access it somehow. I can show you.
So the app that I use, I was able to just pull up, I've got everything in full quality on here. I can access them at full quality. So I'll show you that afterwards if you want. Yeah.
What's your opinion on the role of tripod?
Oh yeah, you didn't actually mention tripods. If you're gonna be in any one spot for a while, if you're setting up like a feeder setup or a water drip or something, it's a game changer to have a tripod set up. If you're doing any sort of photography where you yourself are getting into a little more precarious situation, whether you're getting into water or you're climbing down like a jetty, having a tripod solely for your own safety is really important. I've climbed down things using the tripod just as an extra brace, like just like a hiking stick. When I'm out doing stuff in a marsh, I use it. I open the legs all the way and I use it as like a walker. If I'm crawling on something like for the eiders and I'm on ponds with permafrost on it, I'm on my knees and I'm just like scooting along using the tripod and everything, just for my own stability. And that way I can let go of the camera if I need to use my hands. So I can let go of the camera, it's not hanging at my side or anything. So yeah, anytime you're getting yourself into a more precarious situation, having a tripod for your own stability is really nice.
Also, I really appreciated your tips on like getting putting yourself in a better position to photograph ducks and like also minimizing stress in that way, like breaking up your shape and whatnot.
Yeah.
Give me tips for I know sometimes when you're like on like photographing songbirds in the summer, it can be like a really tricky situation. The birds can get like really mad at you. Give me tips for minimizing that stress and getting better images during the summer for songbirds.
Like for getting close to like nesting songbirds.
Yeah.
So for my what I typically do for a lot of the especially the 3 species up there right now that nest by me, I just go out there and I spend enough time, like I kind of have an idea of where the territories are. And so there was a year, I think it was like right after everyone moved away and COVID started, Cassidy and I went out to this one park like every day. By the end of the spring, we knew exactly where this one Kentucky warbler's territory was. We knew like where he went to feed, so we just kind of sat more by where we'd see him go feed, and we'd wait for him to come to that area. And so in that case, just spending time with him, kind of getting an idea for where they're going, and if you can figure out where the nest is, and you can kind of position like where are they coming and going from, you can go kind of stake them out there. That way they're less focused on you being near their nest. It's not necessarily easy to do, and it's not going to work for every species you're trying to photograph, but there's one specific one like that you're after that spending enough time out there can help.
Any questions, anything? Thank you so much. Any other questions? I can give Tyler's contact. He's easy to access, but